Hello, my name is Regina Rana. I am Counsel and Director of Managed Review at Tannenholtz and Marr. Today I'm going to be walking through how our firm uses Logitech mouse software in tandem with Relativity shortcuts to create coding macros. Combining shortcuts in this way is a game changer for the efficiency and accuracy of a review, and it really allows the team to focus on what's important, the content of the document, while minimizing the fatigue associated with coding. First, let's start with our keyboard shortcuts in Relativity and make sure these are set before we slide over to the mouse software. So, opening the keyboard shortcut legend, I've set shortcuts to all of the most common coding choices. Oftentimes, for the less common coding choices, we opt to not start with those and have the team manually select those. But the most common in many cases is responsive, non-responsive, not privileged, confidential, and even non-confidential, depending on what your confidentiality parameters are. So I've set those in Alt 1 through Alt 5. And just as a tip, if you are running a lot of reviews with the same team, and even for yourself, it's really helpful to keep these very common shortcuts the same, workspace to workspace and case to case. That way you don't have to rebind for the same commands every time in the software. For example, Alt 1 should always be responsive, Alt 2 should always be non-responsive. Whatever shortcut you pick in Relativity, you should try to keep consistent case to case where possible so you don't end up having to create new macros for the same choices in the same fields across cases. With that set up, we can slide over to the Logitech software. The above browser and URL is where you can find the software and download it for your OS. I will be providing a link in the description where you can find this page and download the software, or if you're receiving this via zip file or other means, I will provide that in that message to you. Once you have the G-Hub software downloaded and you open it up, it should look like this black screen here. As soon as you plug in the mouse and you turn it on, you should see an image of your mouse model appear as shown. For me, I'm using the Pro X Superlight. I really like it because it is super lightweight. It doesn't have as many buttons, so you do end up having to change out macros a little more often, but I really like the light, sleek quality of it. So it'll show up here, whatever mouse you have, that's as long as it's Logitech, and you click on it and you'll see the above configuration. From here, you select the macro option, and here's where we can create our macros. So just press create new macro, and then I usually name it by the abbreviation of the choice. So not responsive, not privilege, confidential, NRNPC, and then enter. You always want to select the no repeat. This will only play the macro once. Press this plus sign and then hit record keystrokes. This is where if you press anything else, it will start recording it. So make sure you have the combination of macros correct. So I have Alt 2, Alt 3, Alt 4, Alt Enter. I was holding down Alt the whole time, so even though you don't see it there, I have the lift off Alt, as you can see here. Also note that I included the Save and Next shortcut of Alt Enter. That saves a ton of time as well if you build that into the macro. And we're just gonna hit save. And now we can see in our macro list the NRNPC macro we just made. And this part's really easy. You just click, hold, and drag it to whatever button you want. I like to use these side buttons. And once it's dropped in there, you'll see the macro name here. And once that's complete, you're all ready for that macro and we can test it out. Just click into the Relativity instance and press your macro. So with one click, it clicks everything. As you can see, non-responsive, not priv, confidential, and then it immediately goes to the next document. So what this allows our team to do is fully evaluate the document, and when they've made their decision, if it aligns with the macro that they have, They only have to click once. And you can see you can get a lot of efficiency, especially if you have like-kind documents together that all have the same coding. So obviously this would be for non-responsive documents. If you are working with responsive documents and you have issue coding on your layout, typically we do not shortcut those and add those into the macro unless it's a very, very common issue code that goes with the responsiveness. If it's not, we'll typically have them tag the issue code that applies first and then use the macro as a completion action. So until you are ready to move on from the document and you've clicked everything else in your layout that's relevant, you don't click the macro. The macro is going to always advance you to the next thing, so it's always the last thing you click. As long as the team utilizing the macros understands this, it really is much more accurate and efficient. And just to really show how dynamic this process can be, you can add other shortcuts as you go and then create macros. The important thing is that everyone is really understanding which shortcuts are tied to what and really understand this process. So I'm going to run through a couple more examples of macros that you could create. The more buttons you have on your mouse, the less you have to change them up. But these are very common combinations, so hopefully you'll be able to reuse them. So first example here, I've added a dummy issue code here. Say there's a specific issue in your layout that the team keeps finding over and over. It comprises about 80% of the responsive documents. It's coded 80% of the time, regardless of whether other issue codes are coded or it's by itself. It's extremely common. For that, I would create a new shortcut. So here I've created Alt-7 for issue A, and we'll go ahead and we'll make a macro for that. So if you remember, responsiveness was Alt-1, and the new shortcut we're creating is Alt-7. Not privileged and confidential seem to be, again, very common in this scenario, especially if you are in documents without privileged terms. So again, I'm going to use the abbreviations just like before. IC1 stands for issue code 1. We like to number our issue codes. This is one of the many reasons why. So from here, you can see there's the new macro. I'm going to drag it over to the other button that's not being used. And then from here, we're all set to begin coding with that new macro as well. So we click into the Relativity instance, and there you go. So that can be very fast. And again, there's nothing that says you have to create a macro for every single choice and save and next in one click. If you start coming across a ton of attorneys' eyes only, maybe you want to create a macro that is just the macro for responsiveness, not privilege or privilege, and then you want to leave the confidentiality coding to be manual because there's too much variation. Anytime you have a lot of variation, maybe you want to consider leaving that field as manual coding. The process is very similar to not having macros. Once again, the main thing to remember is that you always want to click the manual coding first. So if I decide I want to create a responsiveness and privilege macro only, I will still tie it to save and next. I will just click the confidentiality first and then hit the macro. So a good example of this is when you're coding for privilege. You may be in batches where every single document is coded privilege and you want to shortcut that and create a macro for that. So this next example is going to show how that works and how we avoid mistakes associated with that. So here we have it as Alt 6. So the shortcut here that we're going to do is responsive, priv, and confidential. And here's where you can start to see some of the limitations of these mice that don't have a lot of options. I could put it on middle click, that would work. But once you have the macro made, it is very easy to switch them out. So say I've moved from, largely not priv documents into priv documents. I can switch out the responsive not priv with responsive priv, and it's that easy. And if I want to switch it back, I switch it back. So it is pretty easy to switch them out, but if you don't want to worry about that, you can get a Logitech mouse that has many more buttons than this one does. So now that I've tied it to this new choice, we can slide over and test it out. So here's where the principle of coding everything else relevant first really comes into play. So if I have a shortcut and this document is hypothetically coded responsive, priv, and confidential, I need to make sure this privilege claim is clicked if the document is privileged. So I click that first. Again, assuming this document is attorney-client, we can go like that, and then we can hit the macro. And that's really important because you can build in self-QCs where if someone hits the wrong macro and someone hits responsive priv instead of responsive not priv, but they've hit one of these, that'll pop up for them in QC. We know it's a mistake. Same thing for priv redact. If there are things in the privilege description or attorney comment for a standard not priv, not responsive, confidential document, we know that was probably a mistake. So having these built-in manual checks prevents things from sort of running away if someone's misclicking. And from our experience, we found that misclicking is no more common. In fact, it's less common than people misclicking when they're doing manual coding. Finally, I just want to go over a couple tips and tricks to troubleshoot in case Relativity is moving a little bit slow between documents or you have any sort of weirdness with the layout, how you can adjust the macro to accommodate for that slowness. So sometimes, as you just saw in the last portion, when you hit save and next, there's a little bit of a delay. And if your macro moves too fast through the choices, you're not able to visually see that they're confirmed. They are confirmed, but personally, I like to see that it's actually selecting everything that needs to be selected, especially if it's not a required choice, just to make sure it's not deselected by mistake. So as you can see, before I moved on to the next document there, I could see visually that all three were clicked. If Relativity is giving you a hard time or if it's moving too fast for you, there are things we can do to address that. So going back over to the software, you simply click on one of these macros that you want to adjust. In the top right corner here, you'll see something selected called Use Standard Delays. That will be the default. The standard delay between keystrokes is 50 ms. You can adjust these to however short or long you like. Personally, most of the time, I like to make everything 5, except for the one that's going to allow me to verify that everything is visually coded. So for example, I'll move everything to 5 here, and then I'll move this to 500, which is half a second. And that will enable everything to be clicked very quickly, but still give me a time to see that everything is selected. So I'll hit save, move over here, and we'll see how that works. And just to make my point a little more clearly, I'm going to go ahead and change this 500 seconds to 2000. That's 2 seconds, just so you really can see what I mean. see I've clicked one thing, and that delay there was a 2-second delay just so I could verify everything on the layout was coded the way I wanted to. So whatever pace feels comfortable for you, whatever pace you think the team should have when verifying the coding on the document is what I would do. Again, some of it comes down to the system. As you can see, sometimes there's delays like this. It's the normal stuff that you run into every time you're even coding manually sometimes. But that's just a very useful tool, especially when you're doing more complex macros, to be able to slow that down a bit. And that concludes our demo on creating macros for relativity shortcuts. Please let us know if you have any questions. We're always available and eager to assist in building on existing efficiencies in this space. And thank you for your time.